It's 2026 and I still can't shake the feeling that I've never encountered anything truly this diabolical. Like here I am, buried away in my office, poring over Tina Brown's story for probably the 20th time and studying a court transcript that reads more like a playbook for a horror movie. My laptop is filled with unsettling notes, and I've been circling this story for a year or more. And frankly, I'm stunned. I still can't wrap my head around how anyone with half a brain believed they'd get away with this. Were they friends who turned into monsters or monsters who pretended to be friends? Now, that question is what has kept me glued to this story. Most people know that Florida both dazzles and disturbs, like a dream you can't decide rather to escape or surrender to. By day, emerald waters kiss diamond beaches. By night, pythons could be wrestling alligators in a Walmart parking lot or panthers wandering into a church service. It's a paradise built on strange magic. But what unfolded in Pensacola transcends even our wildest headlines. Like, this wasn't Florida man chaos. This was methodical evil, a precision of malevolence that froze the Gulf air. And behind it all, y'all, Tina Brown. So if this is your first time tuning in to Southern Confidential, welcome. I'm Grayson Ellison, your host. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and don't forget, I have the interrogation, the raw interrogation for all three of these women, and I will link those in the description box along with the court documents if you'd like to read it in more detail. Florida's death row for women is a ghost town of concrete and steel. It's a place so rarely occupied, you could mistake it for abandoned. So the women who land there have committed atrocities that make even seasoned detectives lose their lunch at crime scenes. And under Florida's punishing sun, well, compassion withers on the vine. Now, Florida's female death row has welcomed only 3 residents in this past decade. Tiffany Cole. She escaped death when her sentence was commuted to life. And that's a small mercy for the elderly Jacksonville couple that she and her boyfriend left decomposing while shopping with their visa. And then there's Margaret Allen. Never kept her appointment with the executioner. And at age 58, she was discovered lifeless in her cell. Undisclosed causes was all the Department of Corrections would say as they rolled her through shadowed hallways, denying the state its choreographed finale. Tina Brown's name was unremarkable until now. Plain as the tap water in Florida. Forgettable as yesterday's weather forecast. Because now she sits on Florida's death row, a concrete steel purgatory. And Tina's case, well, it has moved differently. In rhythm, like the cannons at a Tampa Bay Buccaneers game. Heavy, unmistakable, and once they fire, well, there's no pulling it back. Now, 12 jurors saw the darkness. And you know what, y'all? They didn't even blink. A judge signed the order. The appeal was stripped away until there was nothing left. Now, you'll find out soon that the trio she led was a desperate, bumbling mess. Anything but savvy. But Tina was the gravity, according to court documents and witnesses, that pulled them all into the abyss. She was the one who went in and never found her way out. And now she sits in a 6x9 cell with a steel toilet, a thin mattress, and 23 hours of solitude each day. So make no mistake about it. Tina Brown may have been the one to strike the match,
But she wasn't the only one there in the woods that night. So there were two others. And the part of the transcript that leaves me dumbstruck is the concept that this wasn't just one person's madness, one person's evil or darkness. It was a collective descent. It's incredulous. So you have a daughter who should have been concerned about prom and homecoming and what college she was going to attend. And of course, a neighbor who should have been minding her own business. But they were both sucked into Tina's orbit like a moth to a fire. They weren't just witnesses, they were a part of it as well. Now, somewhere across that same sprawling complex, at the Department of Corrections, Lowell, behind a different set of heavy steel doors, of course, lives Britnee Miller. Now, Britney was only 16 years old when she followed her mother's lead into the woods that night. Now, Britney is a woman grown up in the sterile light of her cell and having traded her entire youth for a sentence of life in prison. Brittany breathes the same recycled air as the woman who led her there. Two generations of the same bloodline tangled in the fences of the DOC.
And what do you think? Was this a case of friends becoming monsters, or were they monsters just waiting for a reason to find each other?
So let's talk the neighbor, Heather Lee. Heather was the one who brought the tools over like she was lending a cup of sugar. But when the handcuffs came out, that neighborly loyalty just vanished. And Heather was the one who made a different kind of deal. In other words, she flipped on Brittany and Tina. Heather traded her soul and her secrets for a 25-year sentence. So while Tina waits for the end and Brittany settles into forever, Heather's counting the days, hoping her trade bought her enough time to see the sun again as a free woman. And I understand that Heather has about 5.5, 6 years, and barring anything else going wrong, she will be a free woman.
Before we get to the gasoline and the crowbars and the very vicious way that Audreanna's life was taken, we need to talk about the match that actually struck the box. So Darren Lee is Heather Lee's husband. And in a statement that would make your skin crawl, he admitted that he wasn't just sharing his bed with Heather, his wife, he was also sleeping with Tina Brown and Audreanna Zimmerman. So imagine that dialogue hissed over a chain link fence. Imagine the honey and the sweetie route cuddling into something venomous. So while Darren moves between lot 1 and lot 3 like he's some kind of prize, that's the real poison in the water as far as I'm concerned. Of course, we know there were drugs involved and a whole bunch of other improprieties. But Heather wasn't just some helpful neighbor. Now, this is my opinion from the transcript. And she wasn't just lending a hand with a crime, helping out her neighbor. She was a woman whose soul was already scorched to the earth, as far as I'm concerned. And there's a double betrayal there. Heather didn't just see a crime. It's my opinion she saw a place to put all of her jagged and unfiltered rage. So she wasn't just an accomplice. She was a woman looking for something, anything to burn. And that's just my opinion. So let's talk before the ambush. There was friction between all of the girls, right? All 4 of them. And in the cramped quarters of the trailer park, peace was a foreign concept. So you had 2 girls who should have been dreaming of the future. Britnee Miller, a 16-year-old following her mother's jagged shadow, and Audreanna, 19, who is actually a mother of 2. So they were caught in a cycle of trailer park warfare over a shared man-child that spiraled into a toxic obsession. So it was a scoreboard of spite. Who called CPS on whom? Who called Crime Stoppers? And when Tina's tires got slashed, well, she didn't call the cops. She pointed a finger and made a vow. And after a fist fight where Audreanna allegedly tried to tase Britnee, Tina didn't seek a resolution, she sought a reckoning. And so a dialogue in the transcript shows that witnesses indicated that Tina vowed to get today Audreanna.
The case of Brown versus the state of Florida. Counsel?
Dawn McCready for the appellant Tina Brown. This is an appeal of the Circuit Court's denial of Ms. Brown's motion for post-conviction relief. I'd like to begin my argument today with issue 1 of our brief, the ineffective assistance of counsel at the guilt phase of Ms. Brown's capital trial. And but for these errors by counsel, the results of the proceeding would have been different and Tina Brown would have received a life sentence. In addition to Heather Lee's obvious interest in the case as the co-defendant, she also had a substantial motive to both murder the victim and to blame Tina Brown. And starting with the victim was sleeping with Heather Lee's husband, and Heather Lee found out about it. And just a few days before the murder, Heather Lee had gotten into a physical altercation with the victim over this affair because she had just found out. Trial counsel had this evidence before him, and he failed to use it to show bias and to show that Heather Lee had a motive to murder this victim. The trial court found that this testimony would have done little to impeach Heather Lee's testimony about being real close friends with the victim. This finding is not based upon competent substantial evidence, and I disagree with that reasoning that it didn't contradict her testimony of being real good friends. It absolutely did. How good of friends were they really if the victim was sleeping with Heather Lee's husband? At trial, Heather Lee portrayed herself as just another victim in this case. She claimed that she was not involved and that she did not participate in the murder. And so her saying that she was good friends with the victim, this was in order for the jury to believe that, you know, if they were such good friends, then they were less likely to believe that that Heather Lee would have participated in this murder. And this evidence would have shown that they weren't on as good terms as she portrayed it to be. Ms. Brown was prejudiced by this failure to present this evidence, because this is also something that the jury should have been able to consider when weighing the evidence and determining the credibility of Heather Lee. And like prior convictions, this is something that's enumerated in the jury instructions to consider. Bias, motive, does the witness have an interest in the case? And she most certainly did. So in addition to the victim, she also had a motive to testify against Ms. Brown and to blame everything on her, which is what she did. Heather Lee admitted in her deposition that she suspected Ms. Brown had been sleeping with her husband. And trial counsel failed to bring any of this information out before the jury. The circuit court said that there was no evidence that Heather Lee, quote unquote, knew of the affair. But trial counsel still could have cross-examined her on this. Even suspecting that someone's having an affair could be a motive for some people to do crazy things. He could have then always called Darren to confirm that, yes, they were having an affair, because that's what Darren testified to in his deposition. And Darren was Heather Lee's husband. This is something that should have been up to the jury to decide. They should have had this information before them to see that Heather Lee had a substantial motive to murder the victim and to blame everything on Tina Brown. I'd like to talk about two of the impeachment witnesses that could have been called at trial that trial counsel failed to investigate and failed to call at trial in support of his defense. They would have supported his defense that Heather Lee was more culpable and assisted his argument in the penalty phase for a life sentence for Ms. Brown. I'll start with Terrence Woods. So Terrence Woods gave a deposition before trial, and in his deposition, he stated that a few days before the murder, he was over at the trailer belonging to Heather and Darren. He had known them. He was over there, and while he was over there, Heather Lee was outside the trailer, involved in a physical fight with the victim over the affair, because she had just found out that Darren had been sleeping with the victim. At some point, Terrence Woods testifies that Heather Lee barges into the trailer and tells Darren in front of Terrence, I'm going to kill her. She used more colorful language, but I'll tone it down a bit for this hearing. And then a few days after the murder, Terrence Woods stated that he was again back at the trailer with Heather and Darren, and Heather Lee told Darren in front of Terrence that he wouldn't be sleeping with his girlfriend anymore because she killed her. And she admitted that she poured the gas on the victim and set her on fire. The circuit court actually did in this instance find that trial counsel was deficient for not calling Terrence Woods at trial. The court said that trial counsel gave no good reason for failing to do so. However, the circuit court found there was no prejudice because testimony regarding Heather Lee's motive would not have changed the evidence presented that Tina Brown participated in the crime. This downplays the importance of his testimony. Not only did he provide a motive for Heather Lee to murder this victim, but it was also a confession. She said she was going to kill the victim. Days later, after the victim had been murdered, she said that she did it and that she was the one who poured gas on the victim and set her on fire. And it's not, importantly, it's not a matter of whether Ms. Brown participated in the crime, but her relative culpability, right? So that was the whole argument at trial. The state's theory was that Tina Brown was more culpable. And she was deserving of the death penalty. And the defense was that, no, Heather Lee was more culpable. So that was really the issue. So this testimony of Terrence Woods definitely would have assisted trial counsel, would have supported his defense. If he wanted to put as much as he could on Heather, which is what he said, what better way than to use her own words against her? This would most certainly have assisted him in arguing for life for Ms. Brown. The second witness that I'd like to talk about is Darren Lee. So Darren Lee was married to Heather at the time and is actually still married to her. He testified at the evidentiary hearing as to the same information as Terrence Woods regarding Heather Lee's statements both before and after the murder. However, he also testified about a conversation that happened the night of the murder. So after the murder happened, and the people present were Darren, Heather, and Tina. So again, 3 people, no marital privilege. And Heather Lee admitted that she was the one that poured the gas on the victim and set her on fire. His testimony also would have supported trial counsel's defense. Inexplicably, trial counsel stated that he didn't believe this testimony about Heather's confession would have been useful to impeach her credibility. This is not a reasoned strategy. If his defense was to put as much as he could on Heather Lee and argue that she was more culpable, then this testimony would have supported such an argument. There's no reasonable trial attorney who would have forfeited the use of this kind of impeachment material. The circuit court held that since Darren never made any statements to police and never stated in his deposition that Heather had confessed, then trial counsel couldn't be deficient for failing to call him because he didn't know about the statements. This finding ignores the fact that Ms. Brown also alleged that trial counsel was ineffective for failing to investigate Darren. In that instance, trial court found that because trial counsel was not deficient for failing to investigate because he took the deposition, and that was sufficient. At some point after Darren's deposition, Terrence Woods gave a deposition. And in that deposition, as I stated when I was discussing his testimony, he made statements about what Heather Lee said to both him and Darren at the same time. This defeated any marital privilege because a third party was present. This would have led any reasonable attorney to investigate further, to do a motion to redepose in light of this new information. But trial counsel failed to do anything with this. The failure to present a confession by a testifying co-defendant cannot be any sort of reasonable strategy. This would have directly supported his defense of putting as much as he could on Heather and arguing that she was more culpable. The jury never got to hear this very critical information, this powerful information that Heather had planned and then did it. To finish that argument that I was saying, the state argued in both the guilt phase and the penalty phase closings that the person that poured the gas, the person that lit the victim on fire, was the person who actually killed the victim. And that person, in their argument, it was Tina Brown, that person deserved a first-degree conviction and a sentence of death. So that's why this was so important to challenge Heather's credibility about who actually set the victim on fire. That's why that was so critical. And so with that, I will save the remainder of my time for rebuttal. Thank you, Your Honor.
Michael Kennett for the state of Florida. The appellant's argument rests on a faulty premise, and that is this, that the facts of this case would only support one death sentence. But that is just not true. This is a horrific murder, and the facts of this case support a death sentence for each of the three individuals involved: the appellant, her daughter, and Heather Lee. Now, it's true that only the appellant received a death sentence, but that's because she was the only one who was eligible to receive a death sentence. Not because the facts didn't support death for the other two individuals, but because the law does not. Why? Because the appellant's daughter was not an adult at the time of the murder. Despite the fact that the appellant's daughter watched the victim burn alive and say, "Burn, you know what, burn," the appellant's daughter was ineligible to receive a death sentence, not because of the facts, but because she was a minor. Similarly, Heather Lee was ineligible to receive a death sentence because she pled guilty to a lesser included offense, pursuant to a plea agreement with the state. And that second-degree murder conviction made her ineligible for a death sentence. Again, not because the facts wouldn't support it. In the answer brief on page 80, the state cites this court's decision in Henyard, which clearly supports this position. So what are the facts of this case? And they really weren't explored during the oral argument by the appellant. But it's important to start with the motive of appellant. Prior to this murder, the appellant's daughter got into a fight with the victim. The victim defended herself with a taser. That's an important fact, a taser. So a few days later, the appellant and the co-defendants lure the victim into appellant's trailer. It's the appellant's trailer under false pretenses. Let's make up. Let's be friends again. When the victim arrives, it is the appellant who tases the victim repeatedly. And we know this because it's the appellant's DNA that was on the taser. So after the appellant repeatedly tased the victim, the appellant dragged the victim to another area of the home and beat her. They then dragged the victim to appellant's car. Again, it's appellant's car, and the victim's DNA was in appellant's car. The victim and the other two defendants to a remote location where the appellant dragged the victim out of the car. When the victim tried to escape, the appellant and the appellant's daughter grabbed her, subdued her, and then beat her and tased her again. First, the appellant tased while the appellant's daughter beat the victim with the crowbar. Then they switched weapons so that the appellant could use the crowbar and the appellant's daughter could use the taser. Then the appellant went to her car, got a gas can, came back, doused the victim with gasoline, lit her on fire. These are horrific facts that would support a death sentence for any defendant who was a participant in this murder. And we know that it was a planned murder because before all this started, the appellant's daughter told her teenage friend, "We're fixing to kill Audreanna." There is no doubt of a group intent here. And there's no doubt about guilt as to first-degree premeditated murder or first-degree felony murder. As the trial counsel correctly said, this is not a whodunit case. Additionally, the appellant confessed to two different individuals. One, Corey Doyle, who was in Escambia County Jail at the same time as the appellant, and then also Pamela Valley. And Pamela Valley said that the appellant solicited her to finish off the victim when the victim was in a hospital. So there's no doubt about the appellant's guilt, and that culpability is sufficient for a conviction for first-degree murder, and it is sufficient for a death sentence, despite any missed opportunities to impeach Heather Lee. And I would note that Heather Lee was impeached through the testimony of Wendy Moy, who was an inmate at the Escambia County Jail at the same time as Heather Lee. And Ms. Moy testified that Heather Lee confessed to Ms. Moy that she was the one who doused the victim with gas. But it doesn't matter. It's impeachment evidence. And again, as the trial court correctly found, there's absolutely no possibility for prejudice in this case.
To what extent was that specific reason, at the heart of the argument for giving a death sentence here?
Well, certainly the state wants to put its strongest argument forth possible. And the evidence at trial from Heather Lee was that it was the appellant who dragged the victim out of the car. It was the appellant who doused the victim with gasoline. It was the appellant who lit the victim on fire. So yes, certainly the state is going to go with its strongest argument that is supported by the evidence. But we're in post-conviction. There are significant finality interests here. And this is just simply not enough to overturn the conviction or the death sentence, because the evidence of guilt is overwhelming and the evidence of aggravation is also overwhelming. Again, they burned the victim alive. And what makes this case unique is that here you have the victim of a murder who identified the people who murdered her. That doesn't happen very often in a murder case. Of the batteries, the aggravated batteries, and the kidnapping with the asportation. So there's just too much involvement by the appellant. Again, it's her trailer, it's her car, and we have appellant's two separate confessions. And as part of one of those confessions, she solicited someone to finish off the victim. So even with the impeachment even with additional impeachment, because Heather Lee was impeached, even with additional impeachment, it would not have changed the outcome.
It was the math of the crime for me. And it defies any type of logic. And it was basically a transaction written in blood. These three stooges of subdivisional sin decided to play God in a dark Pensacola field, and the imbalance they left behind is staggering. So they took the life of a 19-year-old mother. And for what? In exchange, Britnee got a broken hand and a lifetime in a cage. Heather sold her soul and her secrets for 25 years of looking over her shoulder. And Tina, well, we know she earned a one-way ticket to a cell she'll only leave in a box. They weren't masterminds at all. They were just three broken people who burned down their entire world to settle a petty trailer park grudge. So how did a 19-year-old mother of two end up in the center of a kill zone? So I'm not going to go on record as saying that I think that Audreanna was an angel or some type of saint. The documents don't speak to that. It appears she had her issues of impropriety as well. I just don't think that Audreanna was a killer, right? It wasn't a random visit that night either. Audreanna walked over to Lot 3 because she truly believed the war was over. Tina had spent the entire day playing the role of the reformed friend, watching movies with her, sharing laughs, and acting like the tire slashing, the CPS calls, and the man-child drama were all ancient history. So Audreanna went there that night for something as mundane and neighborly as a tube of ointment. She thought she was walking into a friendship. She was actually walking into an ambush. So let's talk the ambush. According to sworn statement of facts, 19-year-old Audreanna walked into Tina Brown's trailer that night looking for one thing, ointment for her new tattoo. Now, Audreanna believed the war was over. She had spent the day with Tina, all day with Tina, eating and watching movies. She was thinking the slashed tires and CPS calls were actually a thing of the past. She was wrong. She actually was walking into a pre-planned execution. So Audreanna didn't know what was awaiting her and had not been in that trailer more than 5 minutes when the trap snapped shut. So in the kitchen, Tina Brown didn't reach for ointment. She reached for a Talon stun gun. So she began tasing Audreanna repeatedly and screaming, "Did you call Crime Stoppers on me?" So as Audreanna collapsed, shaking and begging for her life, the three stooges of subdivisional sin moved in. So let's talk about Britnee Miller, which is why I think they gave her life. Although she was 16, they still gave her life, right? Because Britney told her friends earlier that night, "We're fixing to KILL Audreanna." So she stepped up as her mom was tasing Audreanna and punched her square in the face. In fact, she punched her so hard that Britney actually broke her own hand. So then the neighbor, Heather Lee, she claimed that she was Audreanna's friend and she was the peacemaker in the situation. But the transcript tells a different story. So as Audreanna's screams filled the trailer, Heather was seen balling up a sock and shoving it into Audreanna's mouth to silence her. Then they would drag her to the bathroom. So if you're wondering how we know exactly what happened inside the trailer that night, well, the answer is as disturbing as the crime itself. So Tina Brown, a woman we can only describe as the mother from hell, didn't just drag her 16-year-old daughter into this murder plot. She carried out the entire brutal opening act right in the front of an audience, specifically Britney's 15-year-old friend, Mallory. So Mallory was the only one in the room that night, the only one in the trailer, that is, that night, with a shred of humanity left. She didn't participate in the attack, and she didn't get in the car when they drove to the woods. Instead, she sat in the trailer and eventually provided the sworn statement that dismantled every single lie that the three stooges of subdivisional sin tried to tell. Because you have to be a special kind of sociopath to commit such a brutal act. And then they did it in the presence of a child, in the presence of Mallory, Britney's friend, as if it was just a normal Tuesday. So Tina and Britney, they didn't even try to hide the violence. They let Mallory watch the tasing and the beating as if it was nothing. And so Mallory's testimony finally put Heather Lee's peacemaker defense to rest. So Heather tried to claim that she was just a horrified bystander and that she was just as afraid as Audreanna was of Tina. But Mallory saw the truth. Heather was an active accomplice. And when Tina held the taser, Mallory testified that she watched as Heather balled up a sock and shoved it into Audreanna's mouth to, cover up the screams, to muffle the screams. So Heather was no peacemaker. And if she was, she should have been reaching for a phone and not a gag. So once Audreanna was silenced, they would tie her, put a pillowcase over her head, and then lead her out to the car. So they were treating her like some prisoner of war. So they hauled her out to Tina's red Hyundai SUV, and this is where the logistics defy all logic. So Britnee, 16 years old at the time, with a freshly broken hand, right? She gets behind the wheel of the car when Heather, the neighbor, climbs into the passenger seat. But Tina Brown, well, she wasn't finished. So to ensure there was zero chance of escape, Tina, according to the court documents, actually crawled into the back with Audreanna. And there she sat, pinning Audreanna down while her own daughter steered them towards the woods. So once they reached the woods, now this is off Ashland Avenue, they would drag Audreanna toward her end. Their master plan became a bumbling disaster. So in the pitch black, they were dropping evidence like a trail of breadcrumbs, right? So at the scene, they leave Britney's shoes. So Britney was so manic that she literally stepped out of her white shoes and left them abandoned in the woods. And then Tina was fighting Audreanna, and then Audriana's trying to fight back with such frantic energy that a piece of Tina's hair weave was ripped from her head and left snagged in the brush next to some evidence of blood. So they didn't even try to hide the evidence. There was a crowbar there that they had beat Audreanna with. They left it in plain view, coated in Audriana's DNA. So, of course, we can't be too graphic, and you probably wouldn't want to hear it anyways. But just envision what happened next. So they get her into the woods. It's dark, right? There's a pillowcase over Audriana's head, and they're still attacking her. They're beating her. And then Tina decides she wants to use a gas can. And so she pulls that out, and she's dousing Audrianna with that. She sets her ablaze. And according to the neighbor, Heather, Britney began jumping up and down in the shadows, screaming, "Burn, be burn." So this is probably another reason why she got life. Because remember, in the state of Florida, in a lot of states, honestly, they did pass a law that if you're a minor, you can't just automatically get life in prison. Typically, you are entitled to an appeal, which Britney did get, but they still upheld the life in prison sentence. And it's indicators like this of having no conscience is probably why they decided to uphold the life in prison. So they left Audrianna for dead, broken and burning, believing that the darkness would swallow their secret. And so then they pile back into Tina's red Hyundai and they head back to the trailer park. Now, Britney would be reunited with her audience, Mallory and another friend, Jessica. So they're waiting for her at the trailer. Now, Britney didn't look like a girl who had just witnessed a murder or been involved in a murder. She looked like a girl with a problem. So now Britney's hand is swelling, it's discolored, and it's throbbing. So she tells her mother that something's wrong with her hand. And in the Mother of the Year award, Tina shows massive compassion, right? I don't think so. She didn't offer to take her daughter or to bandage it. She just tells Britney to drive herself to the ER, which Britney did along with her other two friends, Mallory and Jessica. So in short, this trio thought that the fire had won. And Tina even bragged to a friend, check this out, that they had beaten up their neighbor, left her in the woods, and didn't look back. But then the impossible happened. the news broke that Audreanna was still alive. So Audreanna is now in a medically induced coma at the burn center. Her body, though, a map of thermal injuries. So that's when Tina had this bright idea, in her desperation, to ask her friend Pamela if she would finish Audreanna off before she could wake up. Of course, the friend goes straight to the cops and tell them her account of Tina trying to make her an assassin. So all of this that they did was for nothing. Audreanna, despite having a dislocated jaw, body covered in burns, she found her way to a home, somebody's house, kind of remote in that area. She found her way to this neighbor's porch. And when he came out, he heard muffled, like, sounds almost like low pitch screams. So he comes out of his home and Audreanna's sitting on his front porch. So picture this kind of wraparound porch kind of deal. And she's sitting there with both of her hands in front of her. So she can't even lower her arms at this point. That's how much pain she's in. So he calls EMS and she identified her attackers to EMS, right? And the evidence that they left behind was a prosecutor's dream. The Talon stun gun was found in the wooded area, and the math was undeniable. So Tina's DNA was found on the blood-stained handle of the stun gun, and Audreanna lived for 16 days, just long enough to make sure that her words were the final nail in their coffins. Now we have to look at the wreckage. Tina Brown, the architect of it all. She groomed her daughter for murder and then tried to put a hit out on a dying woman from a hospital bed. She was sentenced, as you know, to death. Now, she did appeal that sentence, and of course, it was denied. She remains on death row, the only woman on Florida's death row as of March 2026. Now, is there any other fitting in for a mother who leads her child into a kill zone? Tell me what you think. Now, Britnee Miller, 16 at the time, driving the SUV, punching Audreanna and dancing basically in her ashes, yelling, "Burn, be burn," while her victim screamed in pain, in agony. So she received life, appealed it, lost, and barring any miracle, Britnee will spend the rest of her life in prison. Does a teenager's age excuse a level of cruelty this calculated? Let me know what you think. And finally, there's Heather Lee, the peacemaker. But we know that was debunked. And according to everything that I've read collectively and allegedly, Tina was just insane. Britnee was following, her mother like a sheep to the slaughter. And Heather had a bone to pick. She had a dog in the fight. Because remember, her husband said that he slept with Audreanna. So she took a plea deal for 25 years in exchange for flipping and turning on her friends. So is 25 years enough for Heather, who stood by and watched Audreanna die, in short? So don't forget that I have the raw interrogation tapes for all three of the girls' interrogation. And it's quite interesting, actually. You get a chance to see their personalities, who the leaders were, who was hard and callous, who kind of broke under the pressure. So I'll link those in the description box, along with the transcript from the court. If you'd like to read the gory details, I would like to have gone into more detail, but YouTube has a lot of restrictions as far as being too gory. So I'll leave that there if you'd like to check it out. Now, as usual, thank you for tuning in to Southern Confidential. And if you haven't already, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you on the next video.